The laboratory door opened. The light from the corridor rushed into the room, only to once again be shut out behind the closing door. Lucien didn't turn on the lights. He walked instead in the pale moonlight spilling through the window and made his way over to the computer. The cold light from the monitor illuminated Lucien's face, casting an immense black shadow on the wall behind him, which coalesced with the dark of night. A few brief clicks of the keyboard sounded, and then the world returned to silence. Lucien sat before the computer in silence, the word error flashing on the screen. Although it wasn't unexpected, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. How long had it been since he'd managed to find this secret database at Black Swan? Lucien had no desire to fish out this memory from the boundless sea of recollection. He continued to sit before the computer until the screen went black and he could see his own face. The cramped black frame contained his image within, as if in silent ridicule. Even though he possessed this secret power, he still had no way of unlocking it, much less... Lucien sighed inaudibly, then turned his gaze elsewhere. He looked at the various devices arrayed in the lab, and the shelves packed with documents and reports. All appeared to be in order, whereas several months prior, this was all a deserted wasteland. Outsiders all believed that Lucien's choice to rebuild the research center here was out of some respect for the past, to carry forth the torch of scientific spirit. But only he himself knew. He was never after such illusory things. The other hidden half of the database was the main reason he chose to rebuild at the old site. Unfortunately, the endeavors he originally thought would go smoothly had hit snags, whether it was the database, the evolution core, or whatever else. Suddenly, an image of the girl sprung forth in Lucien's mind. Some time had passed since their parting under the camphor trees, and yet it seemed like only yesterday. Her face was always so exceptionally clear and distinct in his memory. Without even trying to remember her, she filled up every little nook and cranny in his heart. He sunk briefly into this reverie, when suddenly an invisible pressure swept over him, making it almost impossible for him to breathe. Lucien gathered himself, staring silently at his two hands. He gently furrowed his brow, and a cluster of ice crystals formed in his palms. The next second, it turned to dust, and the disintegrated crystals floated in the air, disappearing without a trace. After a long while, he muttered to himself,
"That fast, huh?"
Lucien turned to look at his assistant standing at the lab bench through squinting eyes.
"You're staring at me. What is it?"
The sudden question startled Pete, who began to fumble around and almost dropped a piece of expensive equipment. He scratched his head in embarrassment and then pointed at the document in Lucien's hand.
I just don't think I've seen that document before.
At Ultima Bioresearch Center, aside from the various experiment materials and equipment, the most important things were documents. After all, most practical experiments required ample theoretical backing. Not unlike other famous professors, Lucien was always very busy, so the materials in the research center were left to his assistants to organize. Sometimes, they knew even better than the professor himself where all the important data records were.
"This is new experimental data."
Lucien answered simply, but then he caught Pete's puzzled gaze, and after a pause, he added,
"It's unrelated to the research center's projects. It is my own personal research."
Professor Lucien's personal research. These words engendered a curiosity amongst the research center's entire staff, and even more so for a young grad student like Pete. He leaned forward, eyes wide and ears pricked.
Might I inquire as to the topic of this research?
Of course.
Lucien maintained a smile as he casually handed the document over to Pete.
This is research into evol instability.
Pete nodded as he pored over the precious document in his hands. The experiment data was incredibly detailed and clear. One could tell just by the look of it that it was the work of Lucien. However, there was one point that Pete couldn't make sense of. The research center did not have the experiment sample necessary to provide this kind of data. In other words, there were no evolvers here upon which Lucien could have run his experiment. He wanted to ask Lucien, but he couldn't find the words. All he could do was knit his brow and remain silent.
You're wondering about the source of my data, aren't you? Don't worry. It was not obtained through any illicit means.
As Pete vigorously shook his head in denial, Lucien took the document back and flipped casually through it. In contrast to his unconcerned motions, his tone had an icy edge to it.
Never again would I.
Pete had never heard Lucien use this sort of tone. Deep, throaty, like a bubble welling up from the depths of the ocean that then turned to ice upon reaching the surface. It sent him into a daze, and when he'd regained his senses, Lucien had resumed his breezy, genial smile, as if what he'd just said was a hallucination.
In the future, there will be much more material related to this. I'll need you to organize it.
Oh, yes, sir.
Satisfied with the response, Lucien nodded and placed the stack of papers into a drawer. Lucien never planned to intentionally hide that research into evol instability from the research center's staff. He needed more data, whether out in the open or in secret. But at the same time, he did not plan to make this research public, because as he had said, this was personal research. Lucien's gaze rested placidly on his hand. He believed the instability of modified evol was a matter of course, just as multiple surgeries would inevitably leave behind side effects. The two operated on the same principle. Gain is always accompanied by loss. It was only fair. He was not afraid. If only he could see the future more clearly. Hazy sunlight shone on his palm. Lucien gently bent his knuckles, as if trying to grasp it in his hand. Back at Black Swan, Lucien had done no shortage of research into possible instability that might occur with evol. But because the individual variance of the experiment samples was simply too large, the corresponding data was inferior, leaving most of the research hung up in the theoretical stage. But today, these shelved theories finally had another opportunity to be verified. The laboratory was completely still. Icy crystals formed in the palm of Lucien's hand, like a flower blossoming silently in the night. The little blossom was suffused with a frosty light, growing rapidly and cutting through the darkness, turning into a razor-sharp ice blade. Lucien silently regarded the blade in his hand as time slipped quietly by. Finally, as if something had been confirmed, his gaze relaxed. With the change in his expression, Lucien's icy weapon disappeared into thin air, leaving only an ethereal frosty mist. That went better than expected. In which case the next step is, Lucien took off his glasses and set them on the desk. He looked at the experiment record, and his relaxed spine once again began to tense. But he quickly suppressed the emotional change. Before today, he'd made many different attempts. Although slightly different from the past, the nature of space folding remained the same. With that thought, a curious sense of ease welled up within him. Indeed, there was nothing to be anxious about. If it truly was an uncontrollable power, it is better to destroy it than to fearfully possess it. He slowly closed his eyes. A pale white glow gathered in his palms. The next second, the light burst forth, enveloping Lucien in a transparent force field. Fragmented scenes flashed through his mind. Lucien thought of a distant day. He and the girl were standing in the light of dusk. He used the power of space folding to send her away, but the silly girl came running back out of concern for him. And another time, after he'd clearly told her to leave him, the two became trapped in a dream. But still, the girl stubbornly refused to leave. Those scenes became hazed over by the soft light and floated in the air, just like everything else that had disappeared before his eyes. The documents by his hand, the lush green-potted plant, a white mouse with its red beady eyes. He'd seen many different things turn into fragments, and this time, it was his turn. Like a puzzle that had been finally pieced together after much effort, yet must once again be torn apart. Lucien opened his eyes. Everything around him had changed. The pitch-black laboratory was no more, replaced by a crescent moon on the horizon and a night breeze mixed with the scent of flowers. He recognized that this was a garden near the research center, its walls overgrown with thick moss and dotted with snow-white flowers. Just as some men yearn for power, naturally others fear it. From the very day the Evolver list was published, Lucien had anticipated the appearance of devolution. He had a pretty good idea of who was behind it, and he did not plan on trying to stop them. The reason was simple. He didn't believe that such a tepid, inefficient method could realize that person's goal. But that girl always disrupted his plans so effortlessly. He never imagined that she'd actually get a hold of the so-called Devo serum and come to him with it. She'd come running in a tizzy, seemingly based on some rumor she'd heard, walking on eggshells to ask him if the Devo serum had come from the research center. But at the same time, she still trusted him. Or else, how could she just lie down so readily and let him draw blood? Too much had happened between them, it seemed. And yet, it was as if nothing had happened at all. She was still the same as before, coming to him for help like second nature, and chasing down clues with him. Right up until the two had returned to the abandoned schoolhouse at the orphanage. Familiar objects appeared one after another. Memories formed an invisible string, pulling them along. Lucien's eyes passed over the girl, his icy gaze penetrating into the depths of the darkness. Sure enough, he saw that girl in the black dress. Her eyes shifted back and forth between Lucien and the girl. Her lip curled up in a sardonic smile, but her tone was one of pity.
It seems the incident 17 years ago wasn't enough. The TV tower incident also didn't teach you a lesson. Oh, you. Still trusting others so easily.
The girl seemed to quiver at these words. She looked to Lucien, then swiftly avoided his return gaze. Lucien noticed her movement. He looked at the girl's face, now turned away from him. Her overly long bangs hid her eyes, but those tightly pursed lips and her fists white with tension clearly told Lucien how shaken she was. This was the most natural and correct reaction. She should have her guard up, especially when facing herself. Lucien lowered his eyes and felt a stinging dryness in his throat. The silence spread. There was no point in continuing the confrontation. Lucien took a small step forward, blocking the girl with half his body. But just then, a voice spoke up from beside him.
I don't need you to tell me what to do.
The weak yet determined voice came at him in a little burst, like a flower blossoming quietly in a corner. The girl grabbed his sleeve, her eyes bright. Overcome with a fervent emotion, she pulled him back once again from the abyss.
I trust Lucien.
In that pair of illuminated eyes, Lucien saw himself. The rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter, scattering the mist drifting over the river, as well as the fragments before Lucien's eyes. The first to disappear were the girl's hands. They were a pair of tiny, thin hands, never too hot in the summer and always cool in the winter. Occasionally, she would stick her hand in Lucien's pocket for warmth, but most of the time, Lucien would take it upon himself to act first, removing a glove to give to her, then taking her other hand in his. But now, the dawn's light shone through her outstretched fingertips, merging them with the clouds in the sky, and preventing anyone from ever holding them again. Next was the girl's body. She was prone to insomnia, so Lucien had told her many bedtime stories. They were always fairy tales that she'd heard her whole life, and she always listened with such attention. For instance, when he got to the part of the story where the mermaid turns into sea foam, the girl would close her eyes as if she couldn't bear to listen and let out a soft sigh. She always felt so much empathy for others meeting their tragic ends, yet completely refused to see herself as a pawn of fate. The final thing to vanish was her face. For a moment, Lucien wasn't sure if he was seeing the scenery reflected in the girl's eyes, or that which was showing through behind her. In a short span of seconds, her eyes went from startled to confused, and finally, composed. A crystalline flare of light diffused in the thin mist, like an iridescent bubble bursting in the sunrise, leaving a strange sense of unreality. She vanished completely in the morning light. The uniquely shaped S-brooch fell to the ground, glinting in the light. Lucien reached down to pick it up, but a sudden pain stabbed at his heart, making him double over and clutch at his chest. From the darkness below the suspension bridge, a figure sauntered out, her light-colored hair shining in the sunlight. Artemis strode forward, but just as her fingertip was about to touch the brooch, a white force field appeared out of thin air, cutting her off from it. She was a bit surprised, but she quickly realized what had happened and scowled at Lucien.
Ares, are you sure you want to continue using Evol?
Lucien did not respond. He silently looked at that brooch, a grim smile on his lips. But his eyes shone brightly. The dawn's rays illuminated them, dispelling all obscurity and hesitation, and filling them with determination.